The Flaxborough Horticultural Society had in its 137th year of existence perfected the art of appearing important without in fact achieving anything of consequence. Its annual Flower and Produce Show, held in the drafty Parish Hall just off Market Street, was the high point of its calendar, a phrase that might suggest dizzying grandeur to outsiders, but which locals translated as a day out with cake. The hall on this particular Saturday was crowded with the usual mixture of vegetable zealots and carnation fanciers, their faces glowing with the righteous satisfaction that comes from having both grown and transported a marrow the length of a kitchen table without once dropping it on one's foot. At the rear, by the sponge cakes and lemon curd jars, a deputation of councillors were making speeches which no one heard because Mrs. Topham's spaniel had just upset a display of runner beans. It was during this muddled climax that Mrs. Edith Tranter made her entrance. Widowed for nearly a year, Mrs. Tranter had lately discovered the social advantages of widowhood when practiced with an air of theatrical gravity. She was on this day dressed entirely in black, an outfit that conveyed mourning formality and a faint whiff of disdain for those still encumbered with husbands. She advanced towards the prize table with a composure that suggested she was arriving not at a flower show but at a funeral. Under one arm she carried her exhibit, a modest but striking bouquet of late roses tied with a black ribbon. Its funereal air was not lost on the audience, though most people were too polite or too eager for jam sponge to say anything. What people did notice, however, was the reaction of Councillor Hargreaves. As master of ceremonies, he had been distributing certificates with the sort of ponderous cheerfulness that only municipal duty could muster. But when Mrs. Tranter placed her entry among the chrysanthemums, he paused mid-sentence, coughed and turned a shade that suggested he had swallowed a wasp. Some said he muttered, "Good Lord," before hurrying on with his presentation. Others swore he dropped the first prize card into entirely the wrong basket. In Flaxborough, where accuracy was valued only marginally less than gossip, both errors were remarkable. An hour later, when the show concluded and the parish hall was empty, save for discarded paper cups and a few dazed geraniums, the incident assumed its full oddity. For Mrs. Tranter's roses had vanished. The bouquet, black ribbon and all, was nowhere to be seen. No one had witnessed its removal. No one apparently had touched it. But Councillor Hargreaves was observed leaving the building early, flustered, and without his usual air of having triumphed over small-town apathy. By Monday morning, the mystery of the missing widow's bouquet had entered the bloodstream of the town as securely as influenza in February. The butcher told his wife that Hargreaves had pocketed it himself. The wife told her neighbour that Mrs. Tranter had staged the disappearance for attention. The neighbour informed the grocer that it had all to do with something unpleasant that had happened years ago. By Tuesday, enough versions of the story existed to fill an entire issue of the Flaxborough Citizen, though the paper, with its usual caution, restricted itself to the headline, "Curious Loss of Flowers at Annual Show Inspector." Purbright read the clipping at his desk with mild interest and no great urgency. He had long understood that in Flaxborough, the line between crime and eccentricity was porous, and that somewhere in the muddle of marrows, jam and vanished roses, there might lie something deserving of his attention. He placed the cutting neatly beside his blotter, folded his hands and looked out of the window with an expression that to his subordinates suggested drowsiness, but which in reality masked the slow, careful turning of a thought. On Tuesday morning, the market town resumed its familiar chatter with renewed vigor, as though the brief excitement of the flower and produce show had merely been a rehearsal for the true performance that followed it. In Flaxborough, no event properly existed until it had been interpreted, embroidered and redistributed in fragments across the counters of shops and the alcoves of tea rooms. The disappearance of Mrs. Tranter's roses, tied so theatrically with black ribbon, had already matured into a full-bodied scandal, though what sort of scandal depended on where one listened. At Parbold's Butcher's, a modest establishment famous more for its proprietor's conversational stamina than his sausages, Mr. Parbold leaned across the counter to inform Mrs. Chubb that Councillor Hargreaves had been seen slipping the bouquet under his coat. He added with relish that Hargreaves had not been himself since last autumn when certain bills were questioned in committee. Mrs. Chubb, who had only entered for half a pound of streaky, widened her eyes, nodded gravely, and assured him she had suspected something of the kind all along. She repeated the story with embellishments to her sister later that afternoon. By the time it reached the sister's husband, the account had become one of Hargreaves being blackmailed by a mysterious figure from Lincoln. Meanwhile, across the high street at Mrs. Dunning's millinery, the roses took on another hue. Mrs. Dunning, who had observed Edith Tranter's theatrical mourning costume with a professional jealousy thinly disguised as moral censure, was convinced the widow herself had engineered the vanishing act. She always was a one for drama, she declared, placing an indignant hatpin through a display bonnet. Why else would a woman choose black roses? You'd think she was auditioning for a funeral in the West End. The notion of deliberate self-advertisement, once uttered, lodged itself firmly among her clientele. By the following morning, Mrs. Tranter was regarded in certain circles as little better than a stage performer, attempting to revive her career by means of horticultural trickery. The grocer, Mr. Sims, offered yet another version. He confided to anyone who would pause long enough by the pickle jars that there had been some unpleasantness in the past between Edith Tranter's late husband and Councillor Hargreaves. He was vague on the details but fluent in hints. It weren't quite above board, their dealings. There were whispers of shares, you know, shares in things what weren't there. When pressed, he shrugged, lowered his voice, and insisted it was before your time. This murkiness naturally supplied more nourishment to gossip than any actual fact could have. Inspector Purbright, who never placed much faith in gossip, yet never dismissed it outright, had instructed Sergeant Love to make a few unobtrusive enquiries. Love, whose notion of unobtrusiveness consisted chiefly in looking taller and more pink-faced than circumstances required, managed to extract half a dozen contradictory stories from as many residents by the close of Tuesday. His report, read aloud in Purbright's office, sounded like an inventory of half-baked puddings, some undercooked, others overdone, none palatable. There's talk of Hargreaves owing money, Love recited, frowning as if the act of reading taxed his sense of fairness. Then Mrs. Dunning says the widow's a bit of an actress. The grocer reckons there's something shady about the late Mr. Tranter's affairs. And oh yes, Mr. Parbold thinks the bouquet might have been taken by mistake. Purbright, seated with his fingertips together, listened without interruption. When Love concluded with a sigh of relief, the inspector merely nodded. "Interesting," he said, in a tone that conveyed no opinion as to the accuracy of the word. "Perhaps you will step out tomorrow morning and speak to Mrs. Tranter herself. Ask her in your usual courteous fashion whether she remembers who last admired her roses." Love looked relieved to have something definite to do. "Right you are, sir, though I dare say she'll think it odd, us bothering her about a bunch of flowers." Purbright smiled faintly. "Most people think it odd that we bother them at all, Sergeant. It seldom prevents us." That evening, the gossip reached the small group that gathered nightly in the snug of the Feathers. There, over pints of mild, several local worthies debated the roses with the solemnity of cabinet ministers addressing an international crisis. Mr. Soper, the bank clerk, was adamant that no ordinary thief would bother with flowers. Therefore, it must be a matter of revenge. "Revenge," he declared, polishing his spectacles, "and in such cases the object chosen is often symbolic." When challenged to explain what symbol a rose tied with black ribbon might convey, he looked about with an air of scholarly patience. Death, of course, mourning, possibly disgrace. This diagnosis carried weight. By the time it filtered into Wednesday's conversations, the missing bouquet was no longer a mere puzzle but a coded message, its vanishing a deliberate act of intimidation or retribution. Who was the intended recipient of this silent threat? Depending on who spoke, it was either Councillor Hargreaves, the widow herself, or, in one oddly elaborate theory, the entire Horticultural Society Committee. On Wednesday morning, Mrs. Tranter herself contributed to the drama by appearing in town once more, still dressed in uncompromising black. She walked with measured dignity, acknowledging greetings with an incline of the head rather than speech, like a minor royal humoring her subjects. In the post office queue, she let it be known, with a sigh that carried to at least 4 listeners, that she had received a letter that very morning, anonymous, unsigned, but containing what she called a very disagreeable remark. She did not specify the remark. She folded the letter, slipped it back into her bag, and departed before further details could be extracted. By midday, the town was certain of 2 things: that Mrs. Tranter was the victim of a cruel and cowardly campaign, and that Councillor Hargreaves was somehow at the centre of it. Hargreaves himself, unfortunately, did little to dispel suspicion. Normally robust, expansive, and given to shaking hands with a firmness designed to suggest the weighing of prime cuts, he had been seen in recent days looking pale and withdrawn. At the council offices he appeared distracted, forgetting the order of the agenda, and once referring to himself in the third person. Even his pipe, usually clenched with the assurance of a man whose opinions were not only sound but final, dangled listlessly from his lips as though reluctant to perform its office. That he, editor of The Citizen, a Mr. Winch, could scarcely contain his delight. He wrote a column that stopped just short of libel, but which posed questions the public will surely wish answered. Had Councillor Hargreaves observed something unusual about Mrs. Tranter's bouquet? What significance might be attached to its mysterious disappearance? And was it not time, the piece concluded, for the authorities to inquire further? Purbright read this editorial with the same mild gaze he applied to most of Winch's efforts. He closed the paper, folded it neatly, and remarked to no one in particular, "So the town has made up its mind. That should make things easier." He did not explain in what way easier, nor did Sergeant Love, who heard the remark, venture to ask. By Thursday, the incident had hardened into legend. The widow who wore black was now, in the collective imagination of Flaxborough, a figure surrounded by dark plots and sinister attentions. That her roses had once been intended merely as a horticultural exhibit was forgotten. The bouquet had become an emblem, and its disappearance a drama more gripping than any staged at the town's theatre. Inspector Purbright, however, regarded the matter with his customary patience. He had observed over many years of service that human beings seldom did anything without some private motive, however trivial. The challenge was not to accept the motive supplied by gossip, but to discover the one concealed by silence. And so he waited, content to let the town talk itself into tangles, knowing that eventually, in some offhand remark or ill-timed gesture, a thread would emerge worth following. It was on Friday morning, when Sergeant Love reported back from his visit to Mrs. Tranter, that the first such thread appeared. Love, earnest as always, recounted the widow's answers to his polite questions. She had indeed noticed several people admiring her roses. Councillor Hargreaves, of course, Mrs. Dunning, the milliner. Even Mr. Sims, the grocer, though his interest had seemed more in the ribbon than the flowers. She had also mentioned, almost in passing, that the bouquet had not been hers originally. The roses, she said, were cut from a neighbour's garden. With full permission, the ribbon, she added, had been lent to her by a gentleman acquaintance. Purbright, hearing this, leaned back in his chair and allowed his eyes to rest upon the ceiling. He said nothing for several moments. Then, with the air of a man remarking upon the weather, he observed, "Curious how often the most trifling contributions come from neighbours and acquaintances. It does suggest a wider cast than we had supposed." Love, puzzled but dutiful, wrote this down as though it were an official instruction. Outside, the bells of St. Swithin's began their practice, sending a scatter of uneven notes across the rooftops. In the inspector's office, silence stretched. Purbright's face revealed nothing, but somewhere beneath the calm surface of his thoughts, the first pattern was forming. Sergeant Love, restored by tea and purpose, arrived at Mrs. Tranter's. Front step half an hour after morning callers had ebbed, and before afternoon callers could guess at their lines. The widow's house, a neat Victorian semi that had recently learned to carry itself with a certain tragic dignity, wore the black crepe wreath upon its door as some women wear a brooch, to hint at character rather than to proclaim it. Love was admitted by a maid-of-all-work so uprightly self-effacing that she might have been recruited from a museum. The drawing room into which he was shown was cool, polished, and arranged with those tidy contrivances that suggest both order and solitude. Mrs. Tranter entered with the measured grace of a woman who has discovered how to let silence speak for. She offered Love a chair and, after a pause exquisite in its economy, asked what the police required. Love explained that Inspector Purbright wished to establish the simplest points first: the bouquet, its origin, its brief display, and its vanishing. No one, he added apologetically, was accusing anyone of theft. There was merely at present a scarcity of explanations. "The roses," said the widow, looking at the mantle as though the flowers might appear upon it out of delicacy, "were not from my own garden. My late husband was enthusiastic about conifers and objected to anything that made a spectacle of itself." Her lips made a small inward curve of remembrance. "I obtained the blooms with permission from Mr. Lionel Pettifer, who lives 2 doors along. He maintains a regrettably operatic bed of dark roses. I chose the least melodramatic among them." "And the ribbon, madam?" asked Love, his pencil obligingly still, lest the scratching seem an indecency. "A gift," she said lightly, though the word landed with more weight than she intended. "Lent to me by a gentleman acquaintance who understood the meaning of restraint. It was the only ribbon I considered suitable. Bright colors would have been out of character." Love ventured to ask for the gentleman's name. The widow considered. Him, his earnest pinkness, his scrupulous politeness. "Mr. Pottle," she said at last. "He is associated with the firm of undertakers in Turl Street. He has, what is the phrase, access to supplies." Love wrote this down while keeping his features from revealing that the police too could have supplied black ribbon, if there were any moral advantage in doing so. He asked next about the show. Had she noticed anyone take particular interest in the bouquet? "Everyone did," she replied in the tone of one who knows this to have been inevitable. "But if you require names, Councillor Hargreaves spoke to me, pleasantly at first. Then he looked at the ribbon, assumed a different countenance and withdrew. Mrs. Dunning examined the bow with the critical affection of a milliner who has just been reminded that the dead dress more consistently than the living. Mr. Sims, the grocer, asked whether black dye stained the fingers. She glanced at her gloved hands. It did not. Love, remembering a rumor about a letter, asked if any communication had reached her since the show that might bear upon the matter. Mrs. Tranter's attention drifted momentarily to a small, lacquered box on the escritoire. "I received an anonymous note," she said. "It was brief and vulgar. I consigned it to the fire because cruelty deserves no archive." She closed her eyes as if to exclude the memory, then added, by way of apology for the destruction of evidence, it contained a single sentence. "Some widows wear black for reasons other than grief." The hand was disguised, the paper common. You may congratulate the author on his thrift. Love, who had never congratulated anyone on their spite, rose with suitable condolences and left with the impression that the widow's dignity was both armor and advertisement. On his way back to the station, he reflected uneasily that Flaxborough contained a number of gentlemen acquaintances who would understand the meaning of restraint. Right up to the moment it became inconvenient, Inspector Purbright received the account with a mild nod. He asked, without emphasis, whether the undertaker's name had indeed been Pottle. Informed that it had, he murmured that the man possessed a steady hand with satin bows in circumstances that seldom encouraged artistry, and suggested that Love might, if the afternoon afforded leisure, inquire whether Mr. Pottle had lately been deprived of any ribbon. Love went out again, not unhappily, for the undertaker's parlour was a place where one could feel respectable by contagion. Purbright, meanwhile, paid a call upon Councillor Hargreaves. The councillor's office, overlooking the square, displayed photographs of himself in the posture of municipal benevolence, breaking a ground, opening an annex, receiving a bouquet from a girl child who appeared to be submitting to the procedure. Bravely, Hargreaves rose with that mixture of pomp and flutter which, in men of his type, masquerades as cordiality. He shook the inspector's hand as if reassuring it that its owner need not fear the weight of authority, so long as it remained in sympathetic custody. "Inspector, what can I do for you? Don't tell me there's been a spate of bicycle thefts. We ought to put a man on that path behind the allotments." Purbright smiled gently. We are always reviewing the disposition of our men, Councillor. Today I'm occupied by a trifle at the horticultural show. A bouquet appears to have missed its journey home. Hargreaves's expression rearranged itself with a neatness that suggested practice. Ah, the widow's black roses. A poor joke. I thought, if you'll permit me, death is not a subject for stylishness. You noticed them, said Purbright, as though Hargreaves had recalled the existence of chairs. Impossible not to. They were thrust among the chrysanthemums like a hearse shop in a sweet parade. The metaphor, while not precise, conveyed feeling. I congratulated the lady, of course. One must at these affairs. Then I remembered an appointment and found I had already kept it. It was mentioned, said Purbright, that you seemed startled on recognizing the ribbon. The ribbon? Hargreaves's hand went to his pipe. Finding it, he fingered it, like a man reminding himself of customs that had made him who he was. No, it was the whole effect, the widow's way of carrying her loss, an ostentatious modesty. It put me in mind. He stopped, looked past Purbright at the window and chose a safer sentence. It put me in mind that I was due at the office. Purbright let the silence lengthen to a comfortable tautness. You left early? For a telephone call, said Hargreaves, recovering briskness. A constituent in distress about curbstones. Purbright did not ask from which telephone the call had distressed him. He confined himself to a small remark about the demands of public service and rose. At the door he paused. Did you know Mr. Tranter? Hargreaves's pipe knocked his teeth as it sought alignment. Casually, he had interests. In conifers, said Purbright. Yes, said the councillor, relieved, and beyond. The parish hall, even emptied of its horticultural fervour, smelled faintly of boiled water and victory sponge. Mrs. Ivy Vie, caretaker, and thin as a frown, met Purbright with the rigid courtesy of a woman who considers floors to be the moral basis of civilization. She showed him the prize table, now bare, and the side door through which, she said, exhibits had often escaped if their owners tired of ceremony. Was the door locked after the show? Purbright asked. I locked it myself, she replied, at 4:30. But between 3 and then folk were in and out with their bits and pieces. You can't watch every jar of jam in a town like this. It would be unchristian to try. Quite, said Purbright. Did you notice anything about the missing bouquet? A vase water spilt? She considered, took a step, pointed to a faint ring on the trestle's varnish. There, not our vases. People bring their own. This was a jam jar, if you ask me. There was a drop on the floor near the door, but that spaniel had been about earlier, so one hesitates to ascribe it to flowers, she sniffed. And there was a smear, a sort of smudge at the latch, as if someone had tugged the ribbon and caught it. Black? Asked Purbright. Couldn't say. The light in here is economical. At the undertaker's, Sergeant Love discovered Mr. Pottle precisely as a just God would have arranged him. Behind a counter, immaculate ringless hands folded upon a ledger, his face so composed that even a sigh would have seemed vulgar. Love explained his errand with deference. Mr. Pottle inclined his head. We carry black ribbon in several widths, he said, as if describing a doctrine. Wired for wreaths, unwired for bows. The quality is constant. The purpose, alas, depends on the user's taste. Would any have gone missing, asked Love, then, aware that undertakers prefer other verbs, added, unaccounted for. We do not leave such things to Providence, Mr. Pottle replied. However, I did, in the past fortnight, supply over-the-counter cash, a yard or two to a lady who wished to make a decorative knot. She regretted that milliners nowadays are frivolous in their colours. Do you recall the lady? Elegant, self-possessed, with opinions about trimmings. But then, said Mr. Pottle with a steadiness that might have been humour, most ladies who come here have opinions. I formed the impression that hats were somehow involved. Mrs. Dunning? Love suggested, emboldened by town knowledge. Mr. Pottle's eyelids made the smallest concession to recognition before resuming their composure. I could not, of course, volunteer a customer's identity, but if hats were a species and milliners their keepers, I should say you are thinking in the correct direction. When Love relayed this to Purbright, the inspector said only, He requested also that Love stop by Mr. Pettifer's and ask, without offence, whether any roses remained that might be persuaded to tell their story. Mr. Pettifer, retired, headmaster and the sort of Rosarian who talks to his plants as if they were sixth formers bound for scholarship, met Love at his gate with a welter of apologies for the bed's disarray. "A lady borrowed some blooms," he said, "and I confess she cut bolder than I would have. But widows must be allowed their gestures. Did you notice which she chose?" asked Love, bent over the labels like a man learning a second language. "The darker, of course. Night Rider, Prince Noir, and that dreadful new hybrid which the catalogues pretend is claret, but which to honest eyes is the color of injured pride. She tied them, I think, to overrule the sillier carnations. I respected that. Did anyone else show interest in them?" "Oh, many admire my beds," Mr. Pettifer said, with the equanimity of a man to whom admiration has become an atmospheric condition. "Though I fear Councillor Hargreaves's admiration tends towards policy. He once spoke of encouraging shrubbery as a moral bulwark. I did not pursue the metaphor." "And the widow? Did she say why the black ribbon?" "She said it was appropriate. Then she said, well, I hardly like to repeat. She said some men only recognize the language of mourning when it is spoken to them." I assumed she meant the late Mr. Tranter, who never attended our shows, but perhaps I assumed too snugly. The day drifted towards evening with that sense of things having politely avoided conclusion. At his desk, Purbright made notes in a small, almost apologetic hand. A bouquet not grown by its exhibitor, tied with ribbon from a shop that usually entreated grief, a counsellor given to pieties and phone calls, a milliner who, tiring of frivolous colours, had gone to an undertaker for discipline, her caretaker with a ring on a trestle and a smudge at a latch, a widow who burned letters and preferred sentences that stung. He reflected, not with cynicism, which he considered lazy, but with experience, that people often borrowed their symbols from trades that handled them most competently. If one desired solemnity, one visited an undertaker. If menace, a newspaper. If absolution, the public. He was not, he told himself, yet obliged to find significance in the places where these supplies overlapped. It would be enough for now to watch how those who had touched the bouquet behaved when the matter touched them in return, and so he walked home by way of the square, pausing to look into Mrs. Dunning's window where mannequins pretended to live. A hat of discreet gravitas had been placed forward, as if to suggest that even joy, if decently covered, could be sold. Across the street, Councillor Hargreaves emerged from his office, saw Purbright, and lifted a hand in the old municipal salute. The gesture wobbled fractionally before it reached its destination. Purbright returned it with benevolent accuracy and continued, not hastening, for there was time enough in Flaxborough for talk to ripen into truth if one did not bruise it by handling Superintendent Harrow, who liked his problems resolvable within the span of a press paragraph, summoned Purbright late on Friday and received him with the look of a man about to request an uncontroversial miracle. He leaned back in his chair, which wheezed as if sharing reservations, and tapped the Citizen editorial with a forefinger that had learned authority from pointing at budgets. "We can't leave Winch to wag the town, Inspector," he said. "Either nothing happened and we persuade him to print that, or something did and we persuade him to print the right something. In either case, the councillors are anxious the matter be put in order." He paused. "Particularly Councillor Hargreaves." Purbright's smile was mild enough to be mistaken for sleepiness. "Anxiety is a natural condition in the presence of unknowns, sir. It will abate the instant we supply a known, preferably the correct one." Harrow accepted this as loyalty in a suit of irony and steepled his fingers. "Your sergeant tells me there's an undertaker's ribbon involved, a caretaker's smudge, and half the town's conscience. If we don't declare for the simplest explanation, the next simplest will do it for us." He tilted his head. "A prank? A bid for notice by the widow? Or, and I mention this in confidence, a jealous tradeswoman who disapproved of death being made fashionable? Tradeswomen have seldom let death monopolize solemn colors," Purbright observed. "But jealousy, yes, that is an adaptable motive. Mrs. Dunning," said Harrow, as one might say, "the path that is signposted." She was seen examining the bow. She is on record deploring the theatrics. She has access to ribbon. She displays hats like reliquaries. If she walked out with the bouquet to teach a lesson about taste, we have a neat circle and nobody seriously injured. Nobody, Purbright agreed, but the truth which is easily bruised. He added gently, nevertheless, we ought to follow signposts at least as far as the ditch beside them. Harrow, who liked a metaphor provided it arrived with its own shoes, nodded. Bring her in for a statement tomorrow, friendly as you please. If she admits she took the silly thing to stop a scene, we caution and close. If she denies, we will see if denial fits. On Saturday morning, Sergeant Love found Mrs. Dunning in her shop, addressing a recalcitrant veil with the faint impatience of a governess who has decided Latin will not be for everyone. She received the police with a composure she kept for customers who proposed feathers in November. If it is about the widow and her ribbon, she said, before Love could apply his careful preface, I should like to note that black is not a trick. It is a counsel. Some people use it for performance, others use it because they have better things to say than color. Love, who feared being recast as a color chart, explained that the inspector had asked for a statement, purely routine, about her observations at the show and afterwards. She gave it with sparing exactitude. Yes, she had examined the bow and remarked that its stiffness suggested undertaker's wire. Yes, she had gone out by the side door at one point to retrieve a hatpin she had dropped on the steps when laughing at the spaniel. No, she had not carried any bouquet, jam jar, or other domestic receptacle, and no, she had not purchased black ribbon at the undertaker's for months. Here she paused, then conceded, annoyed with her own accuracy. Unless one counts a modest length last week for a bereavement turban, there is, as you will appreciate, a season for everything. Love wrote, dutiful and pink. You did leave the hall by the side door, madam? For air, she said. The chrysanthemums were doing their best to asphyxiate virtue. She noticed his pencil hesitate. Sergeant, I did not remove the widow's bouquet. If I had wished to improve Flaxborough's taste, I should have begun with our councillor's ties. It was in its way a clear denial. Love, who had been hoping for a confession wrapped in the courtesy of civic duty, left with the uneasy sense that he had been measured and not found oppressive. On the pavement outside he met Miss Perks, of the post office, whose spectacles delivered to her the world in installments and never with change. Oh, Sergeant, she said, pleased to be consulted before even knowing whether she had been. If you are inquiring about the roses, I can help. I saw Mrs. Dunning leave the hall by the little door at the back. It was just after 3. She had something cylindrical under her arm. I thought at first it was a hat box, but it had a damp patch at the bottom. Not like hats. Could it have been a jar? Love asked, leaning towards the possibility like a man at a counter. A jar would have been heavier, Miss Perks said firmly, revising physics to protect her certainties. But it was certainly wrapped in paper, and the paper was certainly not dry. Love relayed this to Purbright with the satisfaction of a man who has discovered that fate takes not only sides, but statements. Purbright thanked him and requested a note also be taken of the time. Just after 3. He then returned to Mrs. Vi, the parish hall's thin sentinel, to verify closing rituals and to ask whether at around 3 anyone had used the little room by the side door where spare trestles considered their future. Used? Mrs. Vi repeated. People are always using things that aren't theirs, but yes, the milliner was in and out, and your counsellor popped his head in at one point and left it again. Which counsellor? Hargreaves. He was looking for a telephone. I told him phones are where God intended them. He went away with that expression people have when you disappoint them on other people's behalf. Mr. Hargreaves left before 4? Before 3:15, she said. I know, because I look at the clock when people annoy me. It makes the annoyance official. The times, written down, arrange themselves with the tidy eagerness of a story hoping to be believed. Counsellors hoped too. By midday, a whisper, training to be an instruction, suggested that Mrs. Dunning might be asked to attend the station for a brief, amicable discussion. Mr. Winch from the Citizen rang Harrow to mention that his readers would feel safer if the police spared them the burden of imagination. Harrow, feeling the weight of an editorial written but not yet printed, told Purbright that the cleanest cloth often took the fewest creases. "By all means," said Purbright. "Invite the lady to tea." Mrs. Dunning came punctually, carrying herself like a woman willing to be reasonable, provided reason acknowledged its classics. She wore what Love later described as a hat that knew Latin. In the small interview room she sat, declined refreshment and arranged her gloves upon the table, as if they too might be addressed. Purbright proceeded with the same courtesy he might have used to ask for the loan of a book. He accepted. Her earlier account, thanked her for it and asked about the cylinder and the damp paper. "A hat box," she replied. "It had been rained on the day before. The cardboard was sulking. I dried it by the radiator in the little room." She met his eye. "Do you wish me to swear to the weather?" "No," said Purbright. "Meteorology already gives us enough difficulty. And you left by the side door at 3. "Closer to 20 past, she said coolly. "I looked at my watch because I had promised to be rude to a supplier at 1/2 past. She paused. "Inspector, if I may save time, I dislike pretense as a branch of mourning." "That is true. I also dislike rival women who use their bereavement as a stage, but I dislike more than both the notion that I would tidy up an exhibition by theft. If Flaxborough requires correction, I undertake it openly." It was another, clear denial, but this time with the interest of an altered minute. Miss Perks's just after 3 and Mrs. Vi's before 3:15 for Hargreaves. Mrs. Dunning's 20 past, the smudge at the latch, the ring on the trestle, the spaniel's water or someone else's, the undertaker's ribbon, the widow's letter. The narrative most willing to compose itself said, "The milliner, offended by theatrics, removed the bouquet, disposed of its jar, and made of black ribbon a little lecture displayed later in her window." It was plausible. It would content editorials and counsellors and the species of citizen who thinks moral order a matter of promptness. Harrow, apprised of the plausibility, adopted it at once as a man will adopt a dog that already knows his garden. "We could caution," he said. "No prosecution. She admits proximity. The witness places her. The motive is civic hygiene. We warn against future tidying. We print calm." "Calm printed seldom lasts till supper," Purbright remarked. "And cautioning the innocent is a habit best left to philosophy." Harrow blew out a small breath. "You doubt her guilt?" "I doubt our neatness," Purbright said. "Neatness loves to be guilty. Truth is slower at appointments." He folded his hands. "I should like to know whose jam jar made that ring, and whether the side door latch could have acquired a smudge from anything except ribbon. Also, whether—" Councillor Hargreaves found a telephone between 3 and 15 minutes later. Harrow frowned, not at the impatience of the questions, but at their patience. "Very well. But don't let Winch hear we are testing latches while he is lubricating presses." Outside, Flaxborough performed its usual pantomime of relief at an impending conclusion. The Feathers Snug agreed that the milliner would learn a lesson about damp hat boxes. The butcher muttered that wives who disapproved of widows' weeds were always capable of worse. Miss Perks, uplifted by usefulness, told 3 customers that the police had a suspect and that it was the woman with pins, which in the post office grammar meant justice was licking its stamp. Only Mr. Pottle, consulted in the interval between 2 solemn errands, maintained his impassivity. "If the town wishes to apportion ribbon to character," he told Love, "it will discover that character comes in widths." That afternoon, Purbright walked the length of Market Street with the promiscuous alertness of a man who pays attention by habit rather than by purpose. He looked in at the milliner's. The hat of discreet gravitas was now outfitted with a bow whose edges were unwired and lay with a softness undertakers avoided. He paused at the undertaker's. A scrap of wired black ribbon lay in a basket of offcuts, the ends crisp from a careful snip. Outside the parish hall he examined the side door and found the latch polished by fingers more than by fabrics. He knelt, unhurried, and noticed at the door's base a curl of paper softened by old damp and carrying the ghost of a printed pattern. Berries, perhaps, or apricots, that supermarkets favored for labels. He did not pick it up. He straightened as a man might after considering a kneeling prayer and went to speak once more with Mrs. Vi, who informed him, in the tone of one volunteering to help history, that jam jars came to church halls like swallows, returning by instinct, not name. "Does anyone keep a cupboard for such things?" Purbright asked. She sniffed. No cupboard can stand between a Flaxborough person and their jar. When he came out into the square again, Hargreaves was there, quicker than coincidence. He hailed the inspector with relief that insisted on being camaraderie. "I hope you've got it sorted," he said, nodding towards Mrs. Dunning's. "Not that I bear the lady ill will, but some people can't tell the difference between taste and trial by audience." "Trials," said Purbright, "are best left to courts." He allowed his gaze to idle, pleasantly incurious. "Did you find a telephone on Saturday, counsellor, in your rush from the show?" Hargreaves blinked, possibly at the smallness of the question. "At the Conservative Club," he said. "I remembered they keep a decent instrument in the reading room." "And did the curbstone emergency resolve itself?" "Oh," Hargreaves said, regretting the fiction. "That was another day, another call. This, I think, was about... He smiled, broad and municipal. "Town affairs blur, Inspector. They would blur anyone." Purbright accepted the blur with a civility that did not commit him to sharing it. He walked on, his thoughts unshowy, his pace as unhurried as before. If the town desired its suspect, it had one that could be pointed to without offense to larger reputations. He would not pull the neatness out of anyone's hands yet, but he felt, as one feels the change in weather that leaves newspapers wrong by supper, that a smaller thing than motive or opportunity, a little matter of habit or of who remembered, time more accurately than they wished, would soon object to the town's convenience. He reached the station as the bells of St. Swithin's began a practice more confident than their last, and made a note to speak with Mr. Sims, the grocer, not about gossip, but apricot labels. He also wrote almost idly the words "wired or not," then closed his notebook with the satisfaction of a man who has not found an answer, but has discovered where it will dislike being asked. On Monday morning, when the square still had the washed look of a place that had been tidied by weather rather than by people, Purbright crossed to Sims's grocery with the air of a man who wished to buy something unremarkable and know something only slightly. More so. Mr. Sims, cheerful in the way of a person who believes commerce to be nearly the same as kindness, was writing prices in violet figures on a stack of paper labels. The shop smelled of coffee, floor polish, and the faint, democratic sweetness of bulk jam, Inspector, he said as if the visit were a recommendation. "We've plenty of apricot this week. Very popular since the show, I find. People see fruit and fancy themselves industrious." "Industry," said Purbright, "is often a matter of seeing at the right moment." He looked at the labels. "Do you mark them yourself?" "Oh, we have to," Sims said, displaying his rubber stamp with the pride of a man revealing a family signet. "The wholesalers send them without dates half the time. We keep the customer informed. Violets, legible. Black is so judicial." Purbright considered this evidence of typographical ethics. "Do the labels come away easily, Mr. Sims, once applied? Suppose a person wished to reuse the jar." "Ah, the eternal hope," Sims replied. "Soak them, and they oblige, mostly. The glue is improved these days, it knows its purpose." He lowered his voice. "Between ourselves, the Horticultural Society prefers our plain jars. I let them have a few each year, no labels, clean as an altar. A good jar shouldn't make... You guess what it used to be. You supply jars to exhibitors?" "Not officially," Sims said, alert to municipal hearsay. "But the odd one goes out to friends of the shop. There was a little run on them the day before the show. People leave things late, you know. Respectability, entries, every sort of thing. Mrs. Vi sent round a boy for brown paper as well. Church halls devour paper. Brown, not newsprint. Brown is stouter," he said. "It pretends to be useful and often is." He reached behind him and produced a roll. "We sell it by the yard. Would you care for some?" "Perhaps later." Purbright glanced at the labels again. In the margin of the top one, the printer had decorated an apricot with leaves that looked to a forgiving eye like little green commas. The decorative sense was the sort likely to survive in curls when torn. "You were at the show yourself, I think?" "Only early," Sims said. "Delivered lemonade and 2 sacks of sugar for the teas. A committee member signed. The town finances its own diabetes with scrupulous honesty." "And later? You did not call again?" He hesitated. The length of a thought about accuracy. "Just after 3 I looked in," he admitted. "Mrs. Vi had sent word the tea ladies hadn't enough cups. I lent her a crate from the back. Brought them round by the side door, easier than the main. A spaniel tried to assist and we reached. An understanding regarding paws and crockery. The side door, said Purbright, as if memorizing geography rather than opportunity. Did you notice anyone leaving that way? Mrs. Dunning went out with a box. Cross with it she was. The lid had set its face against reason. And your counsellor, Hargreaves, came down the passage looking for a telephone. No one remembers. Where telephones are once they've said they need one. Did he find it? I don't believe so. He went off briskly, as if successful people had already forgiven him. Oh, and the widow Tranter, Sims added, pleased to deliver something. The inspector could surely have guessed. She was with the Roses tying and retying things, and there was a young man, one of Pettifer's boys from school days perhaps, hovering. He admired in a manner that made you feel he'd practiced. A young man? The question was the merest nudge. Dark hair, coat a shade too good for our weather. No, don't ask me for names, I keep accounts, not faces. Sims peered benevolently. Will you be wanting jam, Inspector? The apricot is agreeable this year, less sunburnt. I shall recommend it to Truth if we meet, said Purbright, and purchased instead a small packet of violet pencils, whose usefulness he could not immediately justify. He walked back past the parish hall, paused at the side door and stooped, where the skirting met a small strip of cracked linoleum. The little curl of paper that had once seemed merely obedient to a draft persisted. He took it up without ceremony. The print was a fragment, a patch, of warm color, a suggestion of leaves. On the underside, the faint bloom of violet numbers that had bled through with enthusiasm. He returned it to the floor with the care one uses when leaving a stranger to their own story. It would be an unkindness to promote it to evidence too soon. At St. Swithin's, the bells practiced the plain course, as if simplicity were a standard one could raise and march behind. In his office, Purbright wrote, "Labels travel with jars," and beneath that, "Brown paper by side door." He added a question mark to "young man," and another more personal to the word telephone, which had begun to acquire for him the quality of a character who appears in every scene without managing to speak. Sergeant Love, having been to the Conservative Club at the inspector's request, reported that the reading room had been closed on the afternoon of the show for the polishing of a trophy cabinet, and that its telephone, once decent, latterly removed to encourage cash. Sales at the bar was no longer where respectable men remembered it. An extension existed in the steward's office, but the steward, being playfully authoritarian, had been at the cricket. A note to that effect had been pinned to the door. "So," said Purbright, "the counsellor went to ring where rings were not lately encouraged. One can be historical about facilities." Love, thoughtful, said that Hargreaves had a furrow between his brows like a man who had carried something heavy, and put it down where he hoped to have put it sooner. He did not add that sympathy for civic burdens made him feel almost fraternal toward their bearers. "While you are in a clubbable frame of mind, Sergeant," said Purbright, "look in at Mr. Pottles again. Ask, should it be convenient, whether wired ribbon leaves a mark that could be mistaken for smearing on a door. Latch. Not that we are falling in love with latches, I merely ask in aid of curiosity." Love returned after a time with the gift of undertakerly precision. "Mr. Pottle says wired ribbon is prim. It does its duty and keeps its edge. If it soils anything, it is because the hands that arranged it were previously occupied." His phrase. He also says that wired leaves will not catch on a latch unless the bow is being pulled like a horse leads a cart, which is not how a person of breeding conducts a bouquet. "Breeding," said Purbright, grateful to have it properly defined, "is always useful in reconstructing events. There remained Mr. Pettifer, whose roses had endured transferal with the stoicism of subjects set essay questions they had not revised for. The retired headmaster received the inspector in a greenhouse that had the warm, chalky atmosphere of an old classroom. He was pleased by a policeman's interest in classifications and gave, without prompting, a little discourse. "Hon vases. Jam jars," he said as if quoting a syllabus, "are acceptable to the rustic eye, but competition demands consistency. I once argued for uniform cylinders, glass plain, so that a flower's character stood unassisted. The committee felt it unkind to ignoble jars. The town does not readily part with history if it can be screwed back on. Your neighbor, Mrs. Tranter, borrowed one. asked Purbright. She borrowed Bloom's, he corrected. I believe she found a jar in her own kitchen. If her husband left any sweet thing in this house, it would have been formaldehyde. He smiled with the tired kindness of a man who had spent a career forgiving wit in the young. She tied the ribbon herself at the last. I asked if she would prefer something more traditional. She said no. She preferred something that said what it meant. What did it mean? Said Purbright, as if inquiring into a proverb. She did not answer in words, Pettifer said, but she looked in a direction I chose not to see. I count that answer sufficient. When he had gone, Purbright took once more the long way round the square. Mrs. Dunning had placed in her window the bereavement turban she had admitted existed. Its bow lay soft, unwired, as Mr. Pottle would have required for a living head. Across the road, in the citizen's window, Mr. Winch had posted a small card promising further developments, as though they were a commodity his premises could be relied upon to stock. Purbright reflected, as he allowed a van to pretend precedence, that if one were minded to remove a bouquet without inviting remark, one would not brandish it in the street. One would wrap the jar to hide the wet, and to prevent decent people from supposing one had stolen someone's show. Brown paper at a side door, a curl of apricot label to keep the paper honest, and then a brisk path to wherever the thing was, going who knew where. It was a method the town would approve, the concealment of the domestic by the domestic. At the station, Superintendent Harrow performed a short, hopeful cough. If we are to spare the town a relapse, he said, we might issue a statement that the item was removed through misunderstanding by an exhibitor who regrets the inconvenience. Statements, said Purbright, like hats, are best when they fit the head they sit on. He looked almost apologetic. An exhibitor will do in a pinch. A misunderstanding will serve until tea. But I wish to ask one or two people why their memories of clocks are so loyal. And I should like, for my private entertainment, to see where the ribbon on the widow's bouquet learned its posture. Wired, Mr. Pottle suggests, would stand to attention. Unwired falls with feeling. The bow I saw in Mrs. Dunning's window chose to fall. You are telling me in your fashion, Harrow said, resigned, that we are not yet done with jars, nor with people who carry them as if they were not carrying them, said Purbright, and allowed himself the smallest smile. That afternoon he called again at the parish hall, not to interrogate the latch, but to ask Mrs. Vi whether any paper had been left in the little room that might have once embraced a damp box. She produced from a wastebasket she kept as a moral example to other receptacles, a brown sheet with a faint patch darkened by water and a corner where adhesive had kissed and come away. The faintest bloom of violet digits ghosted the underside. You don't keep such relics? Purbright asked. I keep them, she said, until the dustman proves his existence. Then, with grudging curiosity, is any of this a crime yet? It depends, said Purbright, on whether people wish it to be a misunderstanding. Misunderstandings are very popular just now. He folded the paper with the neutrality of a man preserving a program after a concert he had not entirely trusted to be in tune. As he walked back to the station, a young man passed him, dark hair, coat too good for the weather, and gave him a glance with a politeness in it that could have been rehearsal. Purbright did not turn. He did not need the face yet. He only needed the existence. He wrote down later a description so short it would have embarrassed a novelist, young careful coat, and placed it under labels travel with jars. It looked in that company like an afterthought. Often, he reflected, afterthoughts were where intention rested, while it waited to be noticed. By midday, the town's appetite for an ending had ripened into indigestion. Purbright, who found that too much appetite often meant not enough nourishment, returned to the parish hall kitchen where the tea committee had left behind the sorts of traces ladies believe invisible because they are respectable. Miss Brill and Mrs. Ketley were there in the process of returning cups to their pegs, performing a ceremony that resembled a domestic liturgy. They greeted the inspector with wartime politeness, ready to assist victory by remembering accurately, while retaining the right to nibble at character. It was chaos, Miss Brill said, which in Flaxborough meant that someone had put the wrong teaspoons in the right drawer. The side door was a menace, people treating it like a private entrance. That's where the trouble always begins. Doors that fancy themselves equal. You had a shortage of cups, Purbright prompted. Only because the saucers multiplied, Mrs. Ketley explained, without embarrassment. You know how saucers are, weak-willed. Mr. Sims brought a crate, Miss Brill added. Came round the back with it just after 3. He's a thoughtful man, always looks as if he's about to forgive you for your purchases. We stacked the cups inside before the spaniel offered to assist. Then we bartered a truce. Who else used the passage? Asked Purbright, idly admiring the discipline of cups falling into line. The milliner, Mrs. Ketley said with the tone of a woman naming an element. In and out, box under her arm. She apologized to the radiator for relying on it. And your counsellor, his pipe first, then him. He left a smear on the latch. I wiped it. It was a meeting of substances. Pipe, said Purbright. He had it in his hand, Miss Brill said, pushing the latch down with his knuckles like a man who has taught himself the wrong end of manners. Tobacco does that to a person, gradually the way damp gets at skirting. And the widow? Purbright did not look up as he asked it. She stood by her roses, Mrs. Ketley replied, tying and untying as if she were persuading a child not to speak. There was a young man hovering near enough to be criticized. Dark hair, city coat. He offered to carry something for her, and she said the only thing she permitted to be carried was a conversation. That would be Mr. Parbold's line if he sold talk by the pound, Miss Brill said, pleased by the balance of wit and thrift. And did the young man carry anything for anyone? Asked Purbright. Only himself, said Mrs. Ketley, with care. At the Conservative Club, the steward, Mr. Clutterbuck, had returned from cricket to a sense of grievance against the weather. He showed the inspector the reading room, which smelled of furniture polish rehearsing self-respect. Where a telephone had once squatted with complacent utility, there was a square of paler paneling and the memory of conversations that had been moved to the bar for profit. Any caller would have been disappointed on Saturday, Clutterbuck said. We took the instrument out a fortnight ago. Councillor Hargreaves said the line was unremunerative and the bar was underused. He likes to keep uses where money can find them. He tried the door, Purbright asked. He rattled it. There was a note. A man can be as annoyed with a note as with a person if the handwriting is familiar. Whose was it? Purbright asked, as if such a question were impertinent to notes. My own, said Clutterbuck with dignity. People must be allowed some authorship. From there, the inspector permitted himself a visit to the Citizen, where Mr. Winch proofread, in a trance like a priest checking the sacrament for spelling. He received Purbright with proprietary benevolence. The newsroom contained 2 desks, 1 window, and a junior whose suit suggested that an uncle had died in his size. The young man's dark hair was impatient with his parting, and his coat was too good for any weather Flaxborough had yet offered it. This is Mr. Vale, Winch said, as if producing a comparative adjective. Came to us from Lincoln, where he learned about crime by being disappointed in it. He has been of use in the photographic line. The town likes to see itself. Mr. Vale smiled in the manner of a man aware that smiles can be invoices. Inspector, he said, shaping the title to fit well-bred caution. If there is anything the paper can do, short of prosecution, we are at the service of public interest. Public interest, said Purbright amiably, is always looking for itself in mirrors. You were at the show, Mr. Vale? Briefly, Vale replied. Mr. Winch asked me to secure a few human images. I found them largely vegetable. I took a photograph of the spaniel eating moral instruction and one of Councillor Hargreaves in mid-handshake with a melon. I would have taken the widow's bouquet, but it seemed to be already performing. He adjusted a cuff with more attention than it required. Is it true, Inspector, that black ribbon indicates a second act? True things seldom advertise themselves, said Purbright. Did you happen to go by the side door? I did, Vale said, mildly abashed. The main route was blocked by jams. A young woman from the tea committee asked me to move a crate with cups, and I discovered my manhood unequal to it. I set it down before anything shattered. I met the milliner congratulating a radiator. Why? I enjoy a full picture, Purbright said. It keeps me from decorating the corners. When he left the Citizen, he bore away nothing so cheap as certainty. Only the sense that Mr. Vale had carefully kept his coat out of contact with the world. It was an admirable preparation for journalism, whether for life remained to be seen. The spaniel's owner, Mrs. Topham, intercepted the inspector as he turned into Market Street, dragging behind her the animal which appeared to have attached itself to the pavement out of principle. She considered it a work of public service to recount, uninvited, her view of the show's moral failures. "Dogs are excellent judges of character," she said, and Herbert disapproved of 3 people and 1 object. The object was a jam jar. Herbert always assumes jam jars owe him something. One of the people was that young man with the hair who smelt, if you will excuse the intimacy, of scent. Herbert prefers honest dog. The second was the milliner. He has never forgiven her for putting a veil on a bonnet. The third was the counsellor, whom he associates with whistles. "He smelt of scent?" Purbright repeated. "A faint one," she said. "Urban. I suppose journalists have to smell of something in order to be noticed less." Herbert associates whistles with Councillor Hargreaves. "He believes whistles are devices by which men pretend to control circumstances," Mrs. Topham said, "and he resents the competition." It was not materially a clue, but it ordered a temperament. Purbright had learned to listen to animals as to weather, not because they could be obeyed, but because they warned one to keep a coat handy. At Mrs. Dunning's, the bell on the door tinkled with the sort of discretion that protects hats from surprise. The milliner received the inspector this time as a customer who had lost his way but not his manners. An arrangement of mourning headwear rested in the window, with the composure of opera chorus members tired of waiting. "I see your turban has forgiven its damp," Purbright said, glancing at the soft bow. "Damp is like sin," she replied. "It cannot be hidden, it must be addressed." She watched him consider the ribbon. "Wired lies," she remarked. "Unwired tells the truth. That is fashion's contribution to moral philosophy." "For you went to the undertaker for it," he said. "Not because it is theatrical," she objected, keen for distinctions, "but because he respects straight lines. Millinery must borrow solemnity from somewhere sensible." "Do you know Mr. Vale?" the inspector asked, as if the question had presented itself without effort. "The newspaper boy?" She gave a small smile. "He thinks cameras will rescue him from adjectives. He came in for string a week ago. Tied a parcel like a person writing their name for the first time. Unsteady, but proud." "String," said Purbright. "Brown paper is a terrible temptress on its own." "Brown paper," she said crisply, "pretends to have no opinions." Across the square in the undertaker's cool parlour, Mr. Pottle's quiet made itself available like a chair. He listened to the inspector's question about wired ribbon on door latches and bestowed on it the sort of attention funeral directors give to theological queries they intend to answer in human terms. "If a latch is smudged," he said, "someone's hands have been elsewhere. Grief soils, but ribbon does not, unless pressed into service as glove. Wired will catch only if asked to behave like rope. Our clients do not drag sentiment." "Does anyone ever borrow wreath bows for non-wreath purposes?" asked Purbright. "One cannot stop the living from imitating the dead," Mr. Pottle said, with a grey flicker of humour. "This town is particularly good at rehearsal." By late afternoon, Purbright had taken to the habit of walking the same route twice and noting what the second passing made the first look like. The side door of the hall had acquired a particular eloquence. It was the kind of door that believes it owes secrets no loyalty. He looked again at the latch, clean now, Miss Brill's cloth having reset the moral balance, and imagined a hand coming down on it, while the other hand, occupied with a pipe or a jar, collected blame. The curl of torn brown paper had gone, spirited into the afterlife of bins. In its place remained the faintest suggestion of sticky on wood, like an idea that has not decided whether it wishes to be pursued. He let the square carry him towards the bank and back, following the custom of men who think better when they are seen to be doing nothing. Councillor Hargreaves emerged from his office as if propelled by municipal energy, and seeing the inspector, defaulted to a handshake that wanted to be an endorsement. "My wife says your man Love questioned her about what I was doing with my hands," he said, laughing, "but careful to keep hurt as an option. You'll have us all wearing gloves soon." "Gloves are out of fashion," said Purbright. "Ribbon is in." He glanced no more at the fingers that still carried a faint tobacco stain along the side. "Did you ring your telephone?" "Couldn't," Hargreaves said, annoyed at old facts. "The club has gone modern. I told Clutterbuck a town needs a reliable instrument in a place not lubricated. He doesn't share my views." "No," said Purbright. "He writes his own notes." They parted with civilities which agreed to think well of one another in public. When the inspector turned at the corner, he observed, in the reflection of a shop window, Mr. Vale stepping out of Mrs. Dunning's with a parcel slender and tall. Under his arm, too slender for a hat and too tall for a book. The young man carried it not like a thief, but like a person avoiding the mistake of looking like one. He crossed the road with the careful haste of law-abiding youth and disappeared into the lane behind the Citizen. It was, in the simplest sense, none of the police's business what men carried from milliners to newspapers, but simplicity was not what the case had offered so far. Purbright made a note, "Vale, string, tall parcel," and wrote afterwards a separate, smaller line whose purpose he could not yet have explained to anyone else. "Tranter's grief public, Hargreaves's private, Dunning's correct, Pottle's tidy, Sims's helpful, Clutterbuck's proprietary, Vale's careful." He underlined the last word because it is what young men are when they are not yet sure which part of their story they will later wish to have forgotten. That evening, Mrs. Tranter, in unwavering black, took her measured walk down Market Street. She stopped briefly at the grocer's to examine a jar of apricot, and deciding against it on moral grounds, purchased instead a tin of something that promised to be soup, if assisted. Mr. Sims, who considered soup a metaphor, congratulated her on her restraint. As she left, she met Mr. Pottle, and the two exchanged a nod that had the dignity of an old arrangement. At the corner, she encountered Councillor Hargreaves, who attempted joviality with the energy of a man patting down smoke. Their exchange lasted 3 sentences and ended with the widow's small smile, the one that judged without altering its temperature. When she reached her door, she paused with her key in the lock, aware, because widows learn such things early, that she was seen. Then she entered, having done nothing but altered in 3 minutes the destinies of at least 4 conversations that would begin tomorrow. In the station, Purbright set aside his notebook and regarded the map of the town which his years had folded into his head. He could have pointed to every place where something had been carried without ceremony. Jam jars, small parcels, hat boxes rescued from weather, moral responsibilities that found themselves smudging latches. He touched with a finger the space where the hall sat in miniature, then the square where public opinion promenaded, then the street that held the Citizen like a mirror. The town was always straightening its tie in. He felt no hurry. People would explain themselves if given room. The trick was to make the room exactly the size their conscience could not easily furnish. He wrote one more line before he went home. What does black ribbon remind a man of when he has not been invited to remember? He allowed himself privately to answer funerals, debts, and letters put aside. Then he closed the book because some thoughts do not like being kept out late. Tuesday afternoon found the council offices drowsing under the kind of light that made notepaper appear virtuous, and typewriters look as though they had renounced noise on principle. Miss Treadgold, who kept the outer desk with the piety of a woman protecting a shrine from committee fingers, was sorting the incoming correspondence into categories: urgent, a rarity; important, a superstition; for information, the natural condition of things, and to be answered by someone who had retired. She was about to declare the day satisfactorily concluded when the lift gave a small cough and produced a parcel. It was unremarkable brown paper, the universal disguise of items that want to be received, as though they had arrived by invitation. The address, neatly typed, read, Councillor Hargreaves, private. Miss Treadgold distrusted the word private in a public building. She distrusted it more when it arrived without stamp or postmark. Who brought this? She asked the lift, which replied by closing its doors with the smugness of a messenger who has given nothing away. She sniffed and detected the faint, citified ghost of cologne that hung about people who believed they were about to be taken seriously. She carried the parcel into Hargreaves's office with the same care she bestowed upon minutes of meetings, where money had considered doing something spirited and had been persuaded not to. Hargreaves hunched over a pyramid of papers as if hoping their combined altitude would make a good impression on anyone topographical, brightened at the prospect of being singled out. He slit the paper open with a letter knife he liked to flourish. During economy debates, what emerged was a jam jar whose past association with apricot had not been wholly washed away. In it stood a bouquet of dark roses, tied with a bow of black ribbon, whose wired edges held distress with decent firmness. Hargreaves looked at it, and something in his complexion remembered a Saturday afternoon when the air had seemed full of judgment. Lying against the glass was a small card. It was not handwritten. It had been typed with a ribbon that knew its duty, but had been used with enthusiasm elsewhere. 3 words and a courtesy. In memoriam, good governance. Miss Treadgold, who did not approve of wit unless it could produce receipts, said, "Shall I fetch the superintendent?" Hargreaves said nothing for the span of a thought that ran ahead to where explanations lived, and ignored him. Then he nodded, swallowed, and said he would prefer the inspector. Sergeant Love arrived before Purbright and made at the threshold a visible effort to take the scene in before deciding which part of it to blame. He moved forward carefully, as if roses might prove to have an opinion about the police. Miss Treadgold supplied him with the facts she considered appropriate: an unmarked parcel, left in the lift, no signature, the smell of a gentleman who had used aromatic means to make his presence seem optional. The liftman had been out to lunch. The temporary boy from the rates office had showed someone how to press the button. "Someone?" Love asked. "A young person," Miss Treadgold said, as if the town were perpetually invaded by youth that had been insufficiently explained. Purbright came in quiet as an apology and stood for a moment looking at the bouquet the way one regards a photograph one remembers having been in. He examined the ribbon, touching it with a consideration that would have satisfied Mr. Pottle. Wired, yes, its edge neat, its bow practical rather than theatrical. He lifted the card and held it nearer the light. The purple bloom that ghosts onto paper where typewriter ribbon has tried to be helpful caught his attention. He glanced at the brown paper bunched on the desk. A scrap of adhesive clung to one corner, like a past offense refusing to learn. There was the faintest memory of a printed apricot leaf. "Who knew the councillor would be here this afternoon?" Purbright asked, not looking at anyone in particular. "Everyone," Miss Treadgold said, with municipal honesty. "He likes to be seen to be available." Hargreaves collected himself. "Inspector, this is ridiculous. Someone has a poor taste in allegory. I will not be harassed in my office by horticulture." "No," said Purbright, agreeable. "Outside offices, Mr. Councillor, horticulture can be very insistent. Here it is a guest." He looked at the jam jar and asked Miss Treadgold if the building kept a towel for visitors. She produced one. He touched the towel to the base. It came away with a blush of sticky, no longer visible, but still willing to confess. Love, willing himself into usefulness, asked if anyone had seen the parcel brought in. Miss Treadgold repeated her sequence. The temporary boy, one of those young persons who learned bureaucracy as if it were a modern language, had told her, after the event, that a polite gentleman had asked where Councillor Hargreaves might be found and whether the lift was working. "Dark hair," the boy had said. "Nice coat." He said please and thank you like a person who had practiced. Purbright did not look at Love when he said, "We shall thank the boy for his description. It will improve his sense of being helpful." He replaced the card, gathered the brown paper, and asked Miss Treadgold for the wastepaper basket. She offered it, as though certifying a witness. He placed the paper inside where it could rest without being expected to decide what it meant. The citizen was, by 4 o'clock, drunk on the idea that something had happened near an elected official. Mr. Winch interviewed the word memoriam as if it were a councillor who had spent public funds on a Latin course. Mr. Vale, summoned from the back room where he cultivated descriptions into images, stood at the editor's desk with the same carefulness he had brought to carrying tall parcels 2 days before. He read the 3 typed words and lifted his eyebrows, a degree that would satisfy a mirror without frightening anyone else. "Who delivered it?" he asked, an inch too eagerly for Purbright's taste. "The lift," said Love, who had been sent to cover the press's appetite with the cloth of thin. "Fact, the lift will want a byline," Winch muttered. He tapped the card. "Clumsy satire. Good governance, it sounds like a prayer offered by a civil servant. Is this a prank on Hargreaves?" Or have we a Griffiths and Graft story at last? He looked at Vale with the encouragement a teacher gives a boy expected to have copied well. Vale said he had been in the field most of the afternoon taking pictures of the river. The light, he thought, would flatter the bridge into believing in its stonework again. He did not smell as strongly of cologne as before, only the ghost remained, well-mannered and faintly foreign. "If there's a picture in this," he said, "we should not print it. It would look like a wreath laid on competence." "Competence," said Winch, "is already overburdened. We will print a column instead." He turned to Love. "Inspector Purbright will no doubt prefer we omit names until he has discouraged wrong ones." Love agreed, which was what he had been sent to do. Vale looked at him and for a moment recognized with a practiced man's sympathy the awkwardness of having to be bland in public. He returned to the back room where the good coat was hung on a nail and a parcel, now denuded of its string, leaned against a chair as if entirely incapable of explanations. At the undertaker's, Mr. Pottle considered the description of the wired, bow and placed with a forefinger a small correction on the inspector's mental margin. "That, I think, is one of ours. Not particular as to purpose, we cut by the yard, but the turn, the neat angle at the knot, that is our house habit. I should be mortified to find that habit elsewhere, but habits, like children, sometimes speak in unapproved company." "Are you supplied any this week?" Purbright asked. "A length on Friday," Pottle said. "Cash. A gentleman with a newspaper manner but better grammar." He paused. "Another on Monday morning. A lady whose grief was hypothetical, but her standards fixed. Mrs. Dunning?" Pottle's eyelids confessed, then composure reclaimed them. "A milliner can be trusted not to make a spectacle of solemnity, as a rule." The Feathers Snug that evening supplied the town with an increment of certainty, which is what pubs do between opening time and the second pint. It agreed, in a confiding undertone, that a wreath posted to Hargreaves could only be the work of a person with an appetite for adjectives, i.e., a journalist, or a woman who disapproved of him on principle, i.e., a widow or someone who sold hats to widows. Mr. Soper from the bank was particularly pleased by the Latin on the card, which he believed made culpability academic. Mr. Parbold said black ribbon never improved a counsellor, and that roses ought to be saved for people one intended to keep. Nobody asked the spaniel. Superintendent Harrow, whose appetite for conclusions had no known cure, summoned Purbright and indicated that the parcel altered the geometry of the case. "We are past hat boxes," he announced. "This is a message. Find the messenger. It'll be that newspaper lad. What's his name? Vale. Young men do drama because their backs will take it." "Perhaps," said Purbright. "Yet young men also do errands because older men cannot be seen to. And women do corrections because some men refuse to learn." Harrow, who disliked complexity when it arrived dressed as courtesy, said he wanted a statement by morning. "We can't have councillors being menaced by morning. Either he deserves sympathy and we declare it, or he deserves the other thing. And we'll get there properly." Purbright went home by way of Turl Street and past Mr. Pottle's parlour at the hour when respectable grief locked itself up for the night. Outside, on the step, a widow in black paused to retrieve a handkerchief. It was not Mrs. Tranter. This one had a face that had learned not to show evidence except when its owner permitted it. She nodded to the inspector without curiosity. Purbright raised his hat and walked on with the sense that Flaxborough contained more than enough black ribbon to clothe several meanings. In the morning he began with Miss Treadgold again. "Did the parcel make the desk untidy?" he asked. She admitted it had unsettled the blotter. He requested to keep the paper for a day, the fragment of adhesive, the faint leaf. She presented it with the reluctance of a woman handing over a garment she had ironed. He took it to Sims. Sims turned it over with a grocer's reverence. "That is our apricot," he said, with the satisfaction of a man recognizing his children by their ears. "We print on the roll a little decoration, leaves like commas, violet price. If the adhesive clung, it means the jar was only recently liberated of its past. Did you sell jars recently to any person not officiously connected with jam?" Sims smiled. "To half the town between Thursday and Saturday. The unorganized were inspired by marrows. But Monday morning, yes, one jar to the citizen. Mr. Vale asked for a clean one. He said the editor wanted a prop for a photograph about economy. I sold him one because his politeness seemed to have been ironed, and I approve of that. Back. At the station, Love, sent to the Citizen for a neutral inquiry about office props, discovered that a jam jar had indeed been requisitioned for illustrative purposes, and that the illustration had not occurred because Mr. Winch had decided thrift made for dreary pictures. The jar, said Mr. Vale, had been returned to the world unphotographed. It is probably in the studio, he added, indicating the back room with a hand that volunteered nothing and resented being asked. It was not in the studio. A coil of string was, so were scissors and brown paper, a triangle of which had been cut away with tidy impatience. On the edge of the desk lay a small card, blank, of the sort any office could cut to size when the world required labels. The typewriter had a ribbon that was not new. If one had typed memoriam on it that morning, it would have done its best to be legible while confessing by halo. Purbright did not assemble these into anything so vulgar as proof. He allowed them to stand about, glancing off one another, like people at a reception who suspect they have been invited for a reason. He went next to Mrs. Tranter. She received him with her usual syllable-saving dignity. He told her without embroidery that a parcel of roses had been delivered to the council offices. To Mr. Hargreaves, she said, as if answering a question about weather, it surprised her to be asked. Something flitted across her expression that might have been satisfaction if it had not been so tidily house-trained. Did the card contain the truth, she inquired. It contained 3 words, said Purbright. Most truths do, she replied. The longer ones are 4 after the tea has been poured. Did you send it? He asked as gently as if he were inquiring after a pain. I do not wrap messages, she said after a pause that allowed the question to feel at home. I prefer to wear them. She touched the sleeve of her black coat as if to illustrate the economy of her methods. But I admire efficiency where I find it. When he left, she was still in her doorway, not watching him go, but supervising the idea of his going. He wrote down what she had said and considered how much of it she had meant him to hear. By noon, Hera would have liked the newspaper boy in a room with a table and an explanation. Purbright, who was not yet finished with jars, said he preferred first to ask Mr. Vale whether he believed in economy as a subject for illustration. It seemed polite to offer him the choice of truth before requiring its attendance. He walked to the Citizen and found the young man at his desk arranging strips of negatives into a future. Mr. Vale, he said, when you carried your tall parcel yesterday, where did it enjoy its afternoon? Vale took a breath that any decent coat would have approved. He looked at the inspector and understood that the question did not require a flourish. The lane behind the office, Inspector. Then the council. Then I used the lift. Then I used the stairs because the lift made me feel undignified. Then I left the parcel and went away. Thank you, said Purbright, with the satisfaction of a man who has been told something he had allowed the world sufficient time to say by itself. And now, he added in a tone that turned polite inquiry into a kind of rehearsal, we will begin to find out for whom you delivered it. He smiled mildly. Young men often discover that their errands are older than they thought. Purbright did not answer his own question at once, nor require Mr. Vale to. He let the young man's admission loiter between them like a polite guest who has arrived before the host is quite ready to be gracious. For whom you delivered it, he repeated, in the tone with which one asks after a mutual acquaintance one is not certain either party likes. Did they ask you in person? In a manner, Vale said, choosing his words with the care of a man moving crockery on a shaking tray. The Citizen was asked to make a point to the council, not in print, yet. A small civil hint. I was thought suitable for the errand. By whom were you thought suitable? Purbright's mildness did not diminish the question's appetite. Vale looked down at his hands, which had discovered an interest in a paperclip. A lady from the square, he said at last. She understands presentation. She wished the council to be reminded of tone. Tone, said Purbright. A rare commodity in our markets. Did your editor approve? He discouraged involvement, Vale replied, with an honesty that sacrificed glamour for survival. He prefers our hints to be paragraphs, but he didn't forbid the idea provided no law had to be acquainted with it. And the appurtenances, the jar, the ribbon, the card? The jar I procured, Vale said, flinching at the banality of the confession. The ribbon was provided. The card I typed here because it needed to be even, and our machine is obstinately... Fair, the words were suggested. By the lady, said Purbright, not asking. Vale nodded. She is economical with vocabulary. Economy, said Purbright, is very flattering when it chooses you for its subject. He did not press the name. Names that wanted to be known generally learned to introduce themselves. And why you, Mr. Vale? There are older couriers. For public virtue. Vale's smile was small and unwilling. Perhaps because I look as though I would be careful. Perhaps because I am too new to remember the town's preferences. New people, said Purbright, often borrow the town's. Morals like overcoats, a little too big but warm. He thanked the young man, not for the errand but for his reluctance to be congratulated on it, and left him with the consolations of a conscience that had at least been consulted. On the stairs, the inspector paused, as he often did, to permit his thoughts to catch up without having to run. If Mrs. Dunning were the lady from the square, she understood presentation. She had procured wired solemnity at the undertaker's on Monday. Her dislike of theatrics came close enough to the brink of moral appetite to taste the air. Then Vale had carried her grammar to Hargreaves's desk. He would not ask her for the admission yet. The town had set her as its suspect for the first incident. It would be vulgar to gratify two appetites at once. He went instead to the council chamber and asked for Miss Treadgold, who smelt faintly of official envelopes and lemon. She had repaired the blotter and placed the jam jar in a cupboard behind a stack of minutes, as if burying the dead beneath paper were a service the town charged extra for. You have taken charge of the object, he said. It was wet. She replied, Nothing that enters this room should be allowed to remain ambiguous. Ambiguity makes most of its living here, said Purbright, but I admire correction. He asked whether Councillor Hargreaves had made any remark after the bouquet had been removed to its cupboard. He said that sentiment had no place in policy, she answered, and then he looked like a person depriving himself of a biscuit. Because someone is watching. She considered the inspector over her glasses. Was it the widow? What do you suspect, Miss Treadgold? I suspect people who arrange things, she said crisply. They tidy life to fit their sentences. In so. The bank Mr. Soper received the inspector with a self-importance that had learned to apologize for itself at the door. He was eager to be consulted about any connection between the deceased Mr. Tranter and the councillor, because nothing gratifies a minor official more than having known the beginning of a story that may yet require signatures. Mr. Tranter speculated. Locally, Soper said, taking adventurous pride in the word. He invested in an improvement society we advised him was optimistic. Councillor Hargreaves was on the committee that approved certain municipal conveniences adjacent to a plot Mr. Tranter had interests in. It was all very proper, but propriety felt put upon. There was correspondence. He smiled, scholar to pupil. Propriety always writes letters. And the society's optimism? Asked Purbright. It failed to be contagious, Soper said. Mr. Tranter lost something he would have preferred not to. He died before the matter could mature into bitterness. His widow, I think, inherited the administrative debris of grievance rather than the feeling itself. He coughed. It is never the amount, it is the manner, and the manner of the councillor. Paternal, Soper said, until asked for particulars. In the long greenhouse by Mr. Pettifer's, roses lay out their arguments with the chew. Certainty of scholars who know they will outlive their examiners. The retired headmaster, gardening hat cocked like a gesture towards pavilion wit, listened to the brief outline and shook his head with gentle scorn. Good governance, he said, almost smiling. A phrase with all the content of a school prospectus. It is meant to reassure parents while promising nothing to children. He trimmed a spent bloom. Do you believe our councillor tried to remove a symbol from public view? That would be administrative of him. He would prefer to put the past into a cupboard and the cupboard into a minute. He has the soul of a filing cabinet. Symbols seldom comply, said Purbright. They go where attention is. And the widow? Pettifer asked. An expert in attention, Purbright admitted without malice, but also a student of silence. He did not go to Mrs. Dunning at once. He called first at Mr. Pottle's because the undertaker's calm had developed for him the quality of an instrument against which one may quietly tune one's own. In the cool room, Pottle's hands lay upon the counter, clean and expressive of an occupation in which tidiness is the tribute paid by the living to what they cannot control. "The wired knot at the councillor's," Purbright said. "Not careless," Pottle replied. "No, considered." "The first bouquet, the widow's at the show, did you observe it?" he asked, as if inquiring after the weather on a day someone else had noticed. "I did," Pottle said, after a pause too small to be ostentatious. "Its bow was not ours. It lay with feeling." "A milliner's, perhaps, or a gentleman's who thought himself equal to millinery," Pottle allowed, with tolerance so faint it might almost have been imperceptible disapproval. "Mr. Vale bought a length from you on Friday," Purbright said, as if the matter bored him kindly. "For economy's picture. Gentlemen in journalism often imagine pictures will lend them probity," Pottle murmured. "He has courtesy. He will learn which errands begin as courtesy and finish as statements. Did anyone else seek ribbon between Friday and Tuesday?" "A lady Monday," Pottle replied, "not the widow. One who has clipped wire more often than she has clipped gossip. She knew exactly how solemnity ought to sit." When he left the parlour, Purbright let the noon light re-socialize him and turned down the lane behind the Citizen. Day-old string cut into a little pile and not gathered lay on the cobbles with the prim resignation of something that had been useful and did not resent no longer being. It was an unimportant sight. He stood for a moment longer than it needed, and then walked on as though he had been considering the charity owed to offcuts. The visit to Hargreaves he postponed until he could do it without making the man feel either hunted or pitied. When he went, he invited himself to sit, removed no hat because the councillor's office imposed no form of respect other than attention, and asked about the telephone again, not because he expected a different answer, but because sometimes repetition discovers who grows tired of the subject first. "Much ado about gadgets," Hargreaves said, trying flippancy and finding it made his voice sound careless in a way he did not feel. "If the club had maintained a proper instrument, we shouldn't now be discussing jam jars and flower arranging. There are serious improvements to be made in this town, Inspector." "Improvements are best introduced to people at a pace they can accept," said Purbright. "Who asked you to accept the widow's bouquet so abruptly on Saturday?" "No one," Hargreaves said. "That was the difficulty. And on Tuesday, when a second arrangement made its way to you in a jar, that remembered apricots." "That was impudence," he said, the word escaping like a thin complaint from an old seat cushion. "You cannot allow people to send insinuations to an office of service." "It depends," said Purbright, "on whether the insinuation is the first honest sentence of the correspondence." He regarded the man kindly. "The town remembers everything, Mr. Hargreaves. It pretends for a living to have forgotten. It is an expert actor. It expects its councillors to be stage managers, who keep the right props hidden and the wrong ones explained." "I have explained," Hargreaves said, more to the desk than to his visitor. "If the widow believes, if anyone believes," he stopped. "It doesn't matter what they believe. It always matters what we believe we can afford to ignore," said Purbright and stood. At the door he added, "The first bouquet vanished quickly, the second arrived where you could not choose not to see it. People who wish to tidy grief remove flowers. People who wish to correct policy send them to offices." He let the words have a little time and took himself to Mrs. Dunning. The bell announced him to a display recently rearranged to demonstrate how economy could be a kind of elegance. The milliner looked at the inspector, as a sensible teacher looks at a good pupil about to say something stylish. "Mr. Vale has taste in parcels," he observed. "He has taste in avoiding them," she corrected. "But he is young. He believes good coats are armor. They are, but only against weather." "And you supplied his ribbon." "I shall not insult you by denying it," she said. "He is capable of buying his own, but incapable of choosing the correct width. If a thing is to be said, it should be said legibly." "Legible to whom?" asked Purbright. "To people who think the town belongs to them because they sit in rooms where paper is kept," she said, almost sweetly. "It belongs to those who dress its heads, bury its dead, balance its books, and queue for its stamps. Councillors are briefly a convenience. Did you remove the widow's bouquet on Saturday?" She did not trouble to be offended. "No. If I had, Inspector, there would have been fewer rumours and better reasons." She regarded him a second longer than comfort required. "I would help you tidy this, but the town would accuse me of tidying for decoration, and we mustn't." Confused trades. He thanked her for the compliment embedded in the thin rebuke and left before she had the pleasure of improving his hat by half an inch. At the door she added, like a seamstress setting a final hidden stitch, "Young men run errands for ladies, Inspector. Old errors enlist them." That evening, Flaxborough looked as though it had just congratulated itself on being decent. The lamps came up with the conscientious punctuality of things installed by committees. The inspector walked past the hall, the undertakers, the citizen, and the milliners, and felt the case stir in him not like a puzzle solvable by moving pieces, but like a conversation that had discovered its subject and now required the right question asked at the right table. He sat down with his notebook and wrote no names. He wrote instead 4 trades and their contributions to meaning: grocer, jars; undertaker, wire; milliner, legibility; newspaper, delivery. Beneath them he wrote, as if composing a menu, counsel, appetite. Then, because he allowed himself an occasional luxury, he wrote widow, audience, and drew beside it a small bow that lay in his sketch without stiffness. He considered human nature, which Flaxborough generously supplied in manageable portions. People did not often plot, they mostly behaved. They tidied what offended them, sent what they could not say, refused what asked them to change, and arranged symbols so they might accuse without being thought rude. The guilty here would not, he felt, be the person who had tied the last ribbon or posted the last jar. Guilt was older. It had established itself years before in a committee room where propriety had been made to carry boxes for convenience. He closed the book and wrote to himself on a separate slip of paper, the invitation. That would sound like courtesy and behave like a test. It asked for the pleasure of certain persons' company: Councillor Hargreaves, Mrs. Tranter, Mrs. Dunning, Mr. Winch, with Mr. Vale if free, Mr. Pottle, Mr. Sims, Mr. Pettifer, at the parish hall on Thursday afternoon to discuss, in a spirit of communal thrift and order, the return of containers customarily employed at public events. He smiled at the wording. He would ask, when they had all settled like good citizens, who could identify which jar had been theirs by the manner in which a label had once been removed, who preferred wire to feeling when tying bows for widows, who remembered 3 o'clock as precisely as their conscience required, and who, when presented with a symbol they did not wish to see, preferred cupboards to answers. And then perhaps the jar would return to its right owner, not because glass could remember, but because people did. Thursday brought with it the kind of sunlight that flatters varnish and makes even folding chairs look as if they have led respectable lives. In the parish hall, the trestles were set in 2 sensible rows. On one of them sat a short procession of glass containers, each pure of label but not equally innocent. Mrs. Vi, rigid in a navy cardigan that treated dust as a personal affront, had placed a dish of damp tea towels on the sideboard with the air of a woman providing mercy but expecting it to be refused. A note on the door, her handwriting, firm as a school rule, read, "Meeting containers. Kindly enter by main." Side door for demonstration only. They came as they had been invited, in the order that made most sense to them rather than to time. Mr. Sims first, as befits a man who trusts punctuality because it resembles inventory. Mr. Pottle next, bringing with him an indisputable tidiness. That meant he never appeared to arrive anywhere so much as to be correctly placed in it. Mr. Pettifer, hat in hand and pedagogy about the eyes, paused at the threshold to admire the chairs for being in straight lines. Mr. Winch, of the Citizen, came with the expression of a person considering whether to print a program, and Mr. Vale with a politeness that had taken pains with its hair. Mrs. Dunning entered at an angle to the light that improved her window display by association. The widow, uncompromising in black, took a seat like a person prepared to consent to a public duty, provided its moral was not vulgarized. Councillor Hargreaves was last, his joviality polished thin. Inspector Purbright, standing as if he had mistaken himself for an usher and was content to be corrected, thanked them for indulging the police in what he described as a brief domestic matter connected with public order. Superintendent Harrow sat by the wall like a man attending the theatre for the sake of the interval. "You have all," said Purbright mildly, "at one moment or another, touched upon jars. It is a privilege of civilization. We propose to prevent confusion at future events, to return to their owners those which strayed. Mr. Sims will tell us which came from his establishment by the faint ghosts of his handiwork." Sims obligingly lifted the first jar and tilted. In the oblique light, a blush of violet bled through the glass at a margin where an apricot leaf once fancied itself ornamental. "Ours," he announced, pleased to find fidelity rewarded. "A good glue. It does not quit its post without persuasion." "And persuasion," said Purbright, "comes in two forms, soaking and impatience. We will distinguish them. Mrs. Vi has been generous with towels." He handed one over. Miss Brill, recruited from the tea committee as a witness in a matter of cups, dabbed the base and held up the towel with triumphant impartiality. A pallid stickiness darkened it as modestly as guilt. "Recent removal," Sims certified. "If it had bathed overnight, we should be left with virtue only." "Thank you." Purbright moved down the line, letting them examine. He had set among the jars a single one with a narrow chip on its rim, and another with a rim coarse from past screw-top habit. Mr. Pettifer, delighted by the examination, identified the chip as "from my greenhouse mishap last June, when ambition, hand gravel conspired." He claimed it with the relief of a teacher retrieving a boy he had mislaid after games. "Excellent," said Purbright. "Memory keeps better when given something to hold." He turned the last jar so that the adhesive remnant on one corner caught the light. "This one, I think, remembers its label too fondly to let go completely." Miss Treadgold's voice from the back, she had positioned herself where minutes ought to be taken, observed, "That would be the councillors." "I have not," Hargreaves said, with sudden heat that sounded like cold air in pipes, "brought any jar to this hall." "No," said Purbright. "It visited you at your office." He did not look at the man. "We shall return it then to municipal custody." He placed it on a separate trestle, apart from the others as if to protect it from contagion. "Ribbon," he said, as if introducing a new set piece in a familiar play. "Mr. Pottle, if you would be so kind, would you show us what your house calls a proper bow for solemn occasions?" Mr. Pottle, with no theatricality, and therefore twice the authority, tied a neat wired bow that sat to attention without looking officious. Its edges lay in disciplined angles. The knot presented itself modestly. He stepped back with the humility of a craftsman who expects standards rather than applause. "And now," said Purbright, "a bow for feeling." He looked not at Mrs. Dunning, but at the widow. "If you would favour us, Mrs. Tranter," she rose with the grace of a person aware that being observed is not of itself a plea. She took up an unwired ribbon provided for the purpose, and with hands that did not hurry, fashioned a bow which fell with soft purpose. It had no stiffness. It said what it meant without the need to be held in place. When she had finished, she did not look at it but at the room, as one might after completing a sentence that sounded as it had sounded in the head. "Thank you," Purbright said. "One cannot, I think, mistake one for the other once one has seen both." He let the bows lie side by side in amicable disagreement. "Now," he continued, with the amiable barbarity of a schoolmaster beginning a demonstration, "we will consider a door." He led them to the side entrance, where Mrs. Vi had consented to leave the latch unpolished for an hour. "We have met this latch before. People of different habits approach it differently. Mr. Sims, would you carry a crate of cups and open this for us?" Sims, delighted to be exact, took up the empty crate and, balancing it neatly against his coat, used the heel of his hand to push down the latch, his fingers retaining authority over crockery. "Thank you." "Miss Brill," she performed, with domestic economy. Forearm to latch, shoulder to door, the kind of practical virtuosity that never makes it into hymns. "Mr. Vale?" The young man, parcel under arm as on Monday, approached with the care of someone trained by town pavements to distrust their enthusiasm. He kept his coat slightly away from the frame, nudged the latch with 2 fingers, and slid through at an angle that made minimal contact with anything else. The motion was nearly identical to its memory in Purbright's head. Vale, completing it, coloured very slightly and returned the parcel to its neutrality. "Councillor, if you please, Imagine you are in haste and your hands are in conversation, with other duties. Hargreaves complied. He had, out of habit, brought his pipe to the demonstration, perhaps to reassure the room that he had a personality independent of policy. With the pipe in one hand, he lowered his other to the latch, knuckles first, and pressed, as men do when they have taught themselves to treat handles as things that ought not to notice. The faintest dust raised from the wood, and the same smear along the side of his forefinger that Miss Brill had described made its quiet reappearance. No one spoke. The inspector thanked him as if the man had performed an admirable public service. Back at the trestles, Purbright set down a square of brown paper with a damp paled patch, and near one edge the spectral suggestion of violet digits. He placed beside it the little curl that had lived by the skirting several days longer than dignity would usually allow. "This paper," he said conversationally, "was found in the small room by the door on Saturday. This fragment of label by the door itself. Mr. Sims, is this your persuasion?" Sims, bending over with satisfaction, attested that it was. "And cut, if you'll forgive me, with a grocer's impatience. That corner has been taken off by scissors in a hurry." "Thank you." Purbright turned to Mrs. Dunning with a courtesy that anticipated her own. "Madam, the ribbon on the—" Councillor's bouquet was wired. "Mr. Pottle recognizes his house virtue in the angle of the knot. You bought such a length on Monday. Mr. Vale kindly carried that message, is that correct?" "It is correct," she said, without flinching at the choreography laid bare. "I have long believed letters to the editor an insufficient instrument, where the eye is concerned. And the first bouquet the widow's at the show was tied with unwired. You saw it." "I saw it," she said. "It did not offend me. Only the context offended me." "The context being the company it kept." "At a prize table," suggested Purbright without acid. "The context being a councillor's sudden discovery of delicacy," she returned. "I dislike men who are indelicate in policy, but squeamish over flowers." Mr. Winch, who had been scribbling notes he would later pretend not to have taken, cleared his throat to suggest the press approved of robust metaphors. Mr. Pottle regarded the bows with a melancholy that might equally have been pride. The widow looked neither gratified nor alarmed. She resembled a woman whose part in a story is to have a part and not to want more. Superintendent Harrow, sensing the theatre take, hold in the room without anyone selling tickets, shifted on his chair. "Mr. Vale," Purbright said, the gentleness in his voice preventing the question from sounding like summons. "The words on Tuesday's card, whose were they?" "The milliner's," Vale said. "She gave me 3 options. I chose the one that did the least amount of harm to grammar." "A noble impulse," murmured Mr. Pettifer. "And the jar?" "Bought at Mr. Sims's," Vale said, "because it needed to be clean and not recently proprietorial." "We have therefore," Purbright said almost to himself, 2 bouquets, one wired, one not, one performing at the show, and the other arriving where attendance is compulsory. One carried by a lady, and the other by a young man whose carefulness is a credit to his coat. One whose jar was borrowed, and one whose label had lately been encouraged to part from its history. He let the inventory occupy the room. It behaved like good furniture. "And now," he said, "we come to clocks. Mrs. Vayu observed 3:15. Miss Perks thought she saw just after 3. Mr. Sims delivered cups just after 3 as well. Councillor, you left before the quarter." The bouquet vanished between those attentions. It is no part of this conversation to accuse anyone of theft, while the town still believes crocuses are capable of malice. But I should be grateful to know if anyone wishes to relieve me of the trouble, who wrapped a wet jar in brown paper in that small room, and then, occupied at the latch, left a mark that has since been wiped. He did not look at Hargreaves when he said it. He looked at the trestle where the jar sat apart, the paper beside it like a piece of conscience that had been ironed and would not take the crease. The silence acquired that thick, upholstered quality, peculiar to English rooms attempting decency in the presence of awkwardness. It was the widow who moved first. She laid her gloved hand lightly upon the unwired bow she had tied, and then withdrew it as if the gesture had been a courtesy to the dead inspector, she said, her voice without heat. "Are we to be told there was a crime?" "We are to be reminded," he said, "that meaning travels by very ordinary routes. It goes out of side doors because people prefer to keep the front for ceremony." Hargreaves found his voice, not in defense but in irritation with the arrangement. "If anyone has anything concrete to say," he began like a man trying to negotiate with water, "let him say it. Concrete is for curbstones," said Purbright gently. "We are in the parish hall." He placed his hand on the jar a moment, then released it. "For today, this will do. We will return each container to its proper kitchen and each bough to its proper trade. Tomorrow, perhaps, we shall decide which cupboard ought to have been left closed and which opened earlier." He thanked them with a sincerity that took no sides, and the meeting dissolved the way respectable meetings do, by pretending there had been nothing to see, and yet leaving everyone with something to carry away. On the threshold, Vale paused as if tempted to apologize to Eyre. Mrs. Dunning straightened a hat no one had touched. Mr. Pottle retrieved a spare inch of wire he had not left. Mr. Sims, always judicious, offered Hargreaves a paper bag for the jar, as though comfort might be furnished if packaging were correct. The widow stepped into the sunlight, and Flaxborough, watching from its pavements, decided the afternoon had been a success because there had been chairs and nobody had raised their voice. Purbright remained a moment longer at the side door, his fingers resting where knuckles had made their acquaintance before. He was not smiling. He was thinking about cupboards. He was thinking about letters put aside and telephone calls attempted to rooms that no longer kept instruments for scruples. He was thinking, too, about how often a town will choose a neat story if it can be made to sit, and how with a very small adjustment to the cushion underneath, a different story will sit even better. He went out by the main door because one should occasionally show an example to a latch. The parish hall emptied itself of obligation by slow degrees, as respectable places do, and by late afternoon the town had folded its curiosity back into errand pace. Purbright let a decent interval pass, then asked for a quieter room where chairs did not give people ideas about meetings. The council's small committee room, with its table polished by issues that had elected not to be decided there, obliged. He invited only those who would be improved by brevity. Councillor Hargreaves, Mrs. Tranter, Mrs. Dunning, Mr. Vale, and, because tidiness deserved a witness, Mr. Pottle. Miss Treadgold, on whom minutes grew like lichen, occupied the far corner, with a notebook, not writing yet, but allowing the possibility to sit near her. The inspector opened without ceremony. "We have," he said, "mistaken a jar for a culprit. It is understandable. Objects accept blame with more grace than people. But the thing that went wrong here was conduct. The jar only provided it with a handle." He turned, freshly courteous, to the widow. "Madame, your bouquet at the show. Roses. From Mr. Pettifer. Ribbon lent you by a gentleman who understood restraint. A kitchen jar pressed into duty. You tied the bow yourself. It fell with feeling. You placed it where it could not help but be seen. Then it vanished. Between 3 and the quarter, the side door obliged it. Mrs. Tranter regarded him with that grave economy she saved for transactions where dignity and truth could be paid for separately. "Yes. To remove it unnoticed," Purbright went on, "required brown paper, the grocer's, not newspapers. The latter would have made a fuss about ink. It required, too, someone who could carry a jar without appearing to carry anything, and a hand on the latch that had reason to avoid finger and palm." He looked at Hargreaves without accusation. "Which is always the heavier kind. You left before the quarter. You went by the side door. Your pipe was in your hand. You pressed the latch with your knuckles as you demonstrated this afternoon. Miss Brill wiped the mark, which was kind of her, but kindness delays fewer things than one might suppose." Hargreaves attempted a laugh that forgot where it had been headed and sat down instead. "Inspector, really, are we to open an inquiry into how men open doors?" "No," said Purbright. "Into why men who open doors sometimes carry other people's messages through them." The councillor's eyes flicked at the widow, then away, as if catching themselves in an association they had not meant to admit to. "It was a flower arrangement," he said, settling on common sense as a trench. "Out of place among marrows." "It was a sentence," said Purbright, with the patience teachers keep in a drawer for afternoons. "It said, 'What unwired bows say when they are employed by people who do not think much of committee drawers.' You recognized it as addressed to you, though perhaps not in so many words. You took it by the domestic route because the front would have required an explanation. You wrapped the jar hastily, hence the torn corner and the little part of an apricot leaf that tried to retire with you, and you removed the thing rather than be seen to refuse its meaning. Hargreaves's color shifted a shade nearer municipal red. You can't prove that, he said, in the tone of a man rehearsing for larger denials in smaller rooms. No, said Purbright, and I prefer not to. Proof is for courts and arithmetic. We are in Flaxborough. Here we content ourselves usually with behavior. He let his gaze move to the undertaker. Mr. Pottle, wired bows behave with discipline. Unwired behave with sentiment. They do, Pottle agreed, with the sadness of a man who has learned how often the living require the dead's vocabulary. The bouquet delivered to your office on Tuesday, Purbright continued, was wired, respectable, explicit, and composed in Mr. Pottle's idiom. It was carried by Mr. Vale at the request of a lady who understands legibility. It was not a theft, it was a correction. Its jar was freshly bought from Mr. Sims because it needed to lack history. Mrs. Dunning accepted the attribution with a tilt of the head that stopped just short of bowing to the obvious. When people will not read paragraphs, she said, one must resort to pictures. Pictures, said Purbright, are not obliged to be polite, only clear. Yours was both, which is why it will now be possible for us to be polite again. He turned back to Hargreaves. Mr. Councillor, there was once a matter concerning Mr. Tranter's speculative enthusiasm and a committee's willingness to be adjacent to convenience. The town remembers it the way it remembers weather, not precisely but with decided feelings about damp. You cannot be blamed for its memory, but you can be held to account for how you respond to symbols of it. Removing one from a table where it could be talked about was unwise. Sending that widow a note, if you did, was unkind. The councillor's mouth opened to deny, then thought better of being specific in a room where precision had lately proved unhelpful. Anonymous notes are the refuge of the ill-bred, he said instead, aiming at universal principle as a smokescreen. Quite, said Purbright. We will classify the letter as ill-bred and not labor it. We will also note that a man who finds himself pursued by flowers might usefully attend to why before picking up brown paper. Vale, who had been quietly practicing invisibility, with limited success, found his voice. Inspector, if I may, no harm was meant by the parcel. I was told it was a municipal joke. Only very good jokes improve behavior, said Purbright. Yours has the merit of having reminded us how people carry things when they think they shouldn't have to. That is a lesson with a future. He spared the young man a small slice of rescue. You will discover that errands done for ladies, newspapers or councils can all be described as journalism afterwards. One must choose which description is the kind one can bear having to repeat. Mrs. Tranter spoke for the first time since her ascent. The voice had that stillness that makes small rooms larger. Inspector, I brought the roses to the show because I thought the town could stand to see something it has always known, not scandal. Recognition. I do not wish to prosecute recognition. No, said Purbright. We do not prosecute it. We merely persuade it to keep to the front doors. He stood, not to impose height, but to allow the meeting to imagine itself, drawing to a well-bred close. My recommendation is as follows. The missing bouquet will remain missing. Its journey has done the work it set out to do. The delivered bouquet will be recorded as an unfortunate civic conceit. No more parcels will make use of council lifts. The Horticultural Society will, at its next meeting, adopt Mr. Pettifer's suggestion of uniform vases so that jars do not repeat temptations to travel. And the council will, when next it meets, minute briefly that all correspondence regarding the Improvement Society has been deposited, without selection, at the Borough Archives. That will do more for good governance than memorials. It was not a rebuke. It was a means of keeping everyone's furniture where it would last. Mrs. Dunning accepted it with the contentment of a woman whose hat had not been disarranged by the weather. Vale looked relieved on behalf of his coat. Mr. Pottle considered that archives were a kind of respectable drawer, and therefore a victory for civilization. Miss Treadgold wrote briskly, as if relief were legible. Hargreaves did not move for a moment. Then he said with the awkward sincerity of a man returning a borrowed tone, "I will make the minute." He added quite softly to the air above the table, "I did not mean unkindness, I meant quiet." "The town does not understand quiet," said Purbright. "It understands courtesy. They are not the same." He reached for his hat and paused. "One further thing. You will return to Mrs. Vi today, the jam jar that arrived at your office, not because it is evidence, because it is hers by nature." The councillor almost smiled. Of course. The meeting dissolved without heroics. They went out singly, which is how a small town prefers to absorb consequence. In the corridor, Mrs. Dunning fell into step beside the widow with the air of two women who had lately disagreed in public, without damaging their ability to nod in shops. "Unwired," the milliner observed, glancing at the black sleeve, "is not always unwise. Wired," the widow returned, "is not always respectable." It had the tone of a draw, politely claimed. Vale, catching up to the inspector at the staircase, said, "You will not prosecute?" "No," said Purbright. "We are not in the business of discouraging language when it has managed a complete sentence. We are in the business of discouraging its misuse. Will you tell Mr. Winch what truly happened?" "I will allow Mr. Winch to print that the parish hall regained its jars," Purbright said. "He can do so at length." Outside, the market street received them as if nothing of significance had occurred, which is the best way for significance to last. The afternoon took on that pleased, almost moral brightness English weather occasionally extends as a favor to order. At the undertaker's, Mr. Pottle moved a small stock of ribbon from one drawer to another with the contentment of a man whose inventory now mirrored his philosophy. In the grocer's, Mr. Sims wrote Violet's figures on new labels with a flourish that stopped well short of gaiety. At the Citizen, Mr. Winch composed a column on civic containers and the lessons they offered to public spirit, while Vale, in the back room, cleaned the typeface with thoughtful patience, as though giving it another chance to print fewer misunderstandings. Inspector Purbright, returning to his office, allowed himself a sit that might have been called reflective, if it had been less comfortable. He looked at the small heap of notes, none of which would need to be kept very long. He was not smug. He stored the thing away in that part of himself where Flaxborough kept its conscience, a tidy corner, sparsely furnished, dusted not too often. What remained was the matter of the archives, the minute and the polite return of a jar to a hall that preferred its side door not to be interesting. He smiled properly only once at the thought that Miss Treadgold would insist the phrase, "without selection," be underlined in the minute. It would be the neatest line in the day. Sergeant Love, bringing in the evening's modest harvest of small offences, hesitated at the door. "Sir, is it done?" "It is finished enough," said Purbright. "If anything else continues, it will be gossip, which we do not arrest unless it wanders into the road without looking." Love nodded, content to have been present in a story that had required so little of force and so much of noticing. He said he had never trusted brown paper since childhood. It always seemed to be thinking. Purbright agreed. "Thinking," he said, "and taking sides." He returned to his paperwork with the peace of a man who had helped a town step around a puddle without insisting it was a lake. There was still Thursday evening to pass and Friday to be got through without Winch discovering a synonym for smear that would survive legal advice. But the shape of things had settled. People would forgive the flowers for what they had said. People would forgive each other for having needed them to say it. And Councillor Hargreaves, if he had any sense at all, would make a small donation to the Horticultural Society's new vase fund and arrange unobtrusively for the borough archives to be dusted. Purbright closed his notebook with a sound that held exactly the right amount of finality for a day that had earned it, and none for any that had not. Outside, St. Swithin's began its practice on a tune so plain it could only have been chosen by a committee. It was exactly what the evening required, something everyone knew the shape of, something no one minded being improved upon next time. The air in the drawing room was close, heavy with the silence of those who had gathered, each unwilling to speak before Miss Marple did. She sat, small and composed, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Her knitting rested beside her on the table, forgotten for once. The fire crackled faintly, and outside the wind sighed across the hedgerows. All eyes were on her, though a few shifted uneasily, already fearing what might come next. "My dear friends," she began softly, her voice carrying with deceptive gentleness, "it is always so easy, is it not, to suppose that wickedness must come from outside, from strangers, from unknown enemies? Yet more often than not, the true danger sits among us, smiling politely, perhaps even offering us tea." She let her gaze drift across the room, pausing just long enough to make more than one person swallow. Colonel Redmayne shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mrs. Redmayne's hands clutched the arms of hers. Young Lydia darted a nervous glance at her uncle. Only one man attempted a faint smile, the sort of smile that did not reach his eyes. Miss Marple continued, her tone unhurried. "We were faced with a death that looked at first like mischance. A fall, a broken neck. It is so. Easy to call it fate. But the little things betrayed otherwise. The flower petals strewn in the wrong place, the cup moved subtly on the sideboard, the peculiar absence of a certain key. Details, perhaps. But details are what murderers most often overlook." The inspector, sitting stiff-backed near the fireplace, nodded. He had learned in his way to wait for her words rather than press with his own. "Consider," she went on, "the question of opportunity. We know that dear Mr. Harcourt was alive at 8:30, and that by 8:45 he was dead at the foot of the stairs. Who then could have contrived such a thing? Only one who knew his habits intimately, someone who could persuade him to pause, to bend, to look away at just the right moment." Lydia gasped suddenly, as though the thought had come to her. "You mean—" Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "Yes, my dear. But let us not run too quickly. The motive must be plain as well. Money, always a temptation. Harcourt had promised an alteration to his will. It would no longer favor the one who had grown accustomed to that expectation." A hush fell. The faint tick of the clock on the mantelpiece seemed louder than before. It was not Colonel Redmayne, though he had quarrelled bitterly. Nor was it Lydia, poor child, though her nerves made her every action seem suspicious. No, it was Mr. Geoffrey Redmayne, the devoted nephew, who alone had the knowledge of the latch, the patience to wait for just the right moment, and the desperate need to secure his inheritance before the will could be altered. There was a sharp intake of breath. Geoffrey half rose, colour draining from his face. "That's absurd," he cried. "You've no proof, none." Miss Marple's eyes were calm, almost sorrowful. "On the contrary, proof rests in small matters, and you overlooked them. The gloves you wore that night carried the faint dust of pollen, the very same flowers Mr. Harcourt kept in his study, and the scuff mark on the stair rail bore a smear of wax from the polish you had applied earlier that day, wax no one else touched. Most telling of all, it was you who fetched his cup of tea, you who urged him to view the papers in the study. Where the latch could be tampered with. It was too neat, Mr. Redmayne, and wickedness so carefully planned is always, in the end, betrayed by its own precision." Geoffrey's lips trembled, and for a moment he seemed to sag, as though his strength had gone out of him. Then, in a burst of defiance, he spat, "He meant to cheat me, to leave everything to Lydia, to waste it all. I had no choice." The inspector rose grimly. "You'll have time enough to explain that, sir, at the station." He moved forward, laying a firm hand on Geoffrey's shoulder. Mrs. Redmayne sobbed quietly into her handkerchief. Lydia clung to her chair, tears brimming in her eyes but mingled with something like relief. The colonel shook his head, bewildered. Miss Marple sat back at last, her task complete. "One should never underestimate what greed can drive a man to do," she said softly. "It is a lesson repeated more often than we like, and yet," she added with a faint sigh, "it always ends the same way. The truth has a habit of showing itself, no matter how carefully it is buried." The inspector led Geoffrey away. The others sat in silence, shaken by the quiet ruthlessness of the revelation. After a time, Lydia came and knelt by Miss Marple's chair, her voice breaking with gratitude. "How can we ever thank you?" Miss Marple patted her hand with gentle affection. "There is no need, my dear. I have always thought that justice, in its quiet way, must be allowed to prevail. It is enough that the shadow has been lifted from this house." The clock chimed the hour. The The wind eased outside, and in the quiet that followed, it seemed the house itself breathed again, lighter, relieved, as though a weight had been taken from its heart. Miss Marple, rising with the help of her stick, gathered her knitting and smiled faintly. "Now I think a nice cup of tea would not go amiss."